Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is criticizing President Trump's trip to Asia this week, saying in a statement, quote, "America is shut down and the president is skipping town." Today's second leg of the trip brought the president to Japan, where he met with Emperor Naruhito at the Imperial Palace. Tuesday, he will meet with the country's newly sworn-in prime minister. Trade is high on the agenda for this trip, with the U.S. and China agreeing to the framework of a deal ahead of Thursday's meeting between President Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping in South Korea. On his way to Japan, President Trump spoke about Xi on Air Force One.
I have a lot of respect for President Xi. I like him a lot. He likes me a lot, I believe, and respects me, and I think he respects our country a lot. And I think we're going to have a successful transaction for both countries.
CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman joins us now. Willie, what needs to happen to get a possible trade deal over the finish line?
Hey there, Lindsay. Good to be with you on this Monday afternoon. Well, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been on the airwaves talking about this framework. Now, we have limited details of that framework, but that is what will indeed be discussed between these two leaders on Thursday when they meet in South Korea. That is essentially what we're waiting for here, for these two men to sit down to discuss this trade deal. Now, there will be a range of issues that both leaders will talk about. Of course, tariffs is one of them. And Secretary Bessent said that 100% additional tariff on Chinese imports appears to essentially be off the table. On top of that, you have the situation with TikTok, soybeans, rare earths, which China, of course, controls the majority of those rare earths elements that we need for our everyday lives, and other goods that are on the table or perhaps up for conversation between these two leaders. So certainly there's lots to talk about, especially when it comes to tariffs and this trade deal. The White House not telegraphing many details, but we do know that there appears to be a framework, and that both leaders will discuss that when they meet in South Korea.
And President Trump said a deal with China could include an agreement over TikTok. What more do we know about that?
Yeah, that's right. And remember, U.S. negotiators have been talking about this in Madrid. Secretary Bessent mentioned that they had essentially come to a deal there, and that the two leaders will discuss the finalization of this deal this week when they sit down together. President Trump has already previously telegraphed that they've gotten their approval of the Chinese for this sale of TikTok, where the algorithm and much of the American operations will be controlled by American investors, and that you'll have a board composed of mostly Americans. So certainly there's lots of discussion there. There are millions of Americans who continue to use TikTok and who perhaps want to continue to use that social media app. And President Trump essentially saying that he's able to save that app with this deal. And perhaps we could see the two leaders not only discuss it, but talk about the final details of that deal between China and the U.S. that would likely include this private component of those companies investing in TikTok and creating that American operation, Lindsay.
All right, Willie James Inman, thank you. For more on the upcoming talks with China, CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd joins us now. Sam, good to see you. What goes into these types of talks from a diplomatic perspective, particularly with China and the U.S. having been at odds over the years on so many issues, including Taiwan?
Well, Lindsay, let me tell you, having been in these kinds of negotiations with the Chinese, they are incredibly intense. You have to remember that there is oftentimes non-simultaneous translation in these meetings. They last a long time. And the Chinese extensively prepare for these meetings by very carefully analyzing the personalities of the U.S. officials that are present, their public statements. They rely, of course, like most countries would, on covert operations as well to try to ascertain what's happening behind the scenes and what U.S. officials are really hoping to achieve. And both sides very carefully study what certain stakeholders in each other's country are saying. So undoubtedly, the Chinese negotiators and President Xi himself are very aware of pressures on President Trump to get China to, for example, buy more soybeans. More than half of U.S. soybeans last year were destined for the Chinese market. Despite what President Trump is saying publicly, there's certainly pressure on President Trump to try to get a truce with China to ease the burden on U.S. soybean exporters, for example. So very careful studies of intelligence, of public statements, and then of stakeholder sentiment in both countries. That's, of course, more of an issue for the United States than it is in China, in which the information environment and the political environment is much more carefully controlled.
So you mentioned a possible pressure point for President Trump with the soybeans. Does that mean you think China has the upper hand going into these talks?
I think that China is operating on a different timeline than the United States. In the United States, we're obviously a democracy, and there are political pressures on not just the president, but members of Congress to try to get a reprieve for soybean farmers and for individuals that are impacted by tariffs. So in the United States, we're just looking at a different time horizon. From the Chinese perspective, in the communist system with the Chinese Communist Party in charge, President Xi is just under different pressures in terms of how long he feels and the Chinese Communist Party feels these trade tensions can continue. So I think the Chinese are playing a longer game here than the United States. And candidly, Lindsay, the Chinese control of not just rare earth resources, but the manufacturing and processing capacity for the vast majority of rare earths really does give them a significant trump card. We all know that these rare earths are critical, not just for consumer goods, but also for the U.S. military. And I think that does give them significant leverage.
All right, Sam Vinograd, thank you.